Welcome, everyone. Um, Today's session is going to be not too long, fairly short. Um, I was going to spend some time talking about how to structure seller notes. I'm going to hold off on that because I think there's something more basic that probably needs to be discussed today. And I know we have a lot of new AEs that have joined the accelerator and or the DWI program. I can't stand that. Accelerator Plus is what we're calling it now. But and I think there probably needs to just be a conversation about some of the basics around screening deals. And so for some of you, it might be a little bit of a review. It can't hurt to listen in again and refresh yourself. But I just want to kind of cover some of the screening questions so that you guys can quickly screen through deals and move on or continue to pursue. And I think there's a lot of overcomplication that's happening just based on some of my conversations with AEs. It seems like as though people are overcomplicating the review process at least the initial review process. And I don't think it needs to be as difficult and complicated as some are making it out to be. So I just wanted to kind of focus on a few key questions that you should be able to answer in order to determine whether you want to pursue the deal or not. I don't want you guys out there over analyzing. I want you, I would like to see you guys reviewing deals quickly, either making an offer or not making an offer and moving on to the next one. There's just a lot of time that can be wasted on a bad deal or not understanding kind of the key points in the deal to determine whether it is a good deal or not. So let's just kind of go over some of the basics. And then if you guys have anything else you want to talk about thereafter, we can. Otherwise, we can end the call fairly early. And then next week, by the way, so next week I wanted to go over structuring seller notes, but I'm gonna hold off on it next week because we're going to have kind of an SBA update. There's a lot of confusion around this update that they had back in May. A lot's actually been interpreted by the banks. And I'll say it this way. Some banks are interpreting the regulations a little bit differently than other banks. But there's now starting to be that's the wrong word to use, kind of I guess a consensus around what the regulations actually mean and what it means for you guys. And so I'm gonna have an SBA. I'm gonna have Jordan Richmond from Ameris Bank on next week to discuss kind of what those regulations actually really mean to you, because there's so much confusion around, if someone retains equity in the business, do they have to be on the loan or not, and at what level? And there's a lot of different answers that are going around, and I think I have a handle on those answers, but I would rather the actual lender kind of discuss the changes with you guys, and you guys can ask any questions around the process as well. But it seems like the banks are starting to come to a consensus around kind of what the regulations were meant to entail, from the buyer's perspective and from the seller's perspective. So we'll have him on next week, and then maybe the week after that, we'll talk about structuring seller notes. So, okay. So from the beginning, obviously, when you guys are looking at businesses, I'm assuming you're looking at businesses in the industries. You don't may not have experience in the industry, but at least you learned about the industry a little bit from the outside. So whether you're looking at a plumbing company or a roofing company or a general contractor, or you're looking at, excavation companies, whatever. I'm assuming you guys are doing at least a little bit of a base level study on the industry itself, so that at least when you're actually looking at a CIM, you have a concept of what the business should look like or what it entails. So I'm going to approach it from that perspective. number one, when you guys are looking at these deals, the first thing, uh, I was always taught is to understand where the revenues are coming from, the major sources of revenue. If there's some ancillary revenue, who cares? But if you understand where the revenues are coming from, that's the beginning of the process in your analysis. So understanding, what do they sell? Okay. I mean, it's that simple. Sometimes people are having a, I'm looking at this business and the cash flow looks great. And then I ask, and I mean, especially if it's an industry that's not kind of been one of those home run industries that we like, and maybe it's something that's unfamiliar to me. You're like, okay, so what are they selling? And then all of a sudden there's this blank stare. Oh, I don't know, but here are the revenues. Let's be, let's be honest with each other. Understanding the revenues is the basics for understanding the business. So understand what they're selling. I mean, and everything that they're selling, not just, if you're a plumbing company, not just the plumbing services, but what kinds of services are they doing within the sphere of plumbing? What kind of services are they providing in roofing? Are they providing just, new roofs, or are they providing maintenance services? Are they providing some sort of coding? You have to understand every line of revenue that they're providing, okay? Because that's going to inform you as far as at least the questions you should be asking along each service line from there on. But understanding where all that revenue is coming from and what are the typical margins on each source of that revenue. Because there's going to be some businesses you come across, maybe it's a roofing company, or no, let's not use roofing, but maybe it's an HVAC company, and maybe they're doing service work. That's great. Maybe that service work is low margin as compared to installation work, or vice versa, or whatever. But understanding where the major sources of revenue are coming from and the margins for that business will kind of get you comfortable as to what they're doing, what the owners are doing in the business, what where they're spending most of their time selling in the business, what types of crews they should have if they're doing mostly installation work versus service. You might have construction specialists in the HVAC space versus construction installation specialists versus people that actually go out and service units. So you've got to understand kind of all of that and kind of where the profits are coming from. And then another basic question you guys should be asking are, who are the customers? Okay. You understand the revenue sources now. You understand the margins they're making. Who are they actually selling these services to? Okay. Understand that, because if there's business customers, you want to understand, are there customers that are making up a substantial piece of the revenue pie for this business? That's a huge risk. Okay. But if you don't understand the customer base, you're not going to understand where that risk lies in the business. If it's a bunch of residential customers, or if it's a retail business, if it's just walk-in customers, what have you, you have to understand the customer base and why they're buying. Okay, there's a there's a in the situation of a residential business, so to speak. If you know that most of their customers are residential customers, then how are they actually obtaining them? Are they obtaining them through SEO? Are they obtaining them through spending in magazines? The typical answer I get, which I kind of roll my eyes at, and I think some of you who've been on my investment committee calls will recognize my look. But as soon as I hear, oh, the business is, it's all word of mouth. They're not doing any advertising. I'm rolling. If I don't do it outwardly, I'm rolling my eyes in the back of my head while I'm talking to you guys. I mean, seriously, if you see a business that's growing 10% per year, and it's not advertising, it's growing by word of mouth, I would be very cautious about what I'm hearing from the broker or the seller. There'd be red flags in my head around that business, because number one, if the business is growing 10% per year and they're not advertising, they're not spending any money on advertising or marketing or anything like that, and assuming there's a natural rate of churn in your customer base, that means they would have to be obtaining a huge amount of new customers every single year, because you're going to naturally lose customers. And if you're not advertising, how are they doing that? The only other way they would be doing that is if the owner is networking. He's like a great networker, and maybe that word of mouth is through his network, that he's constantly selling through his network, but he's not necessarily spending money on advertising. And then they're telling you it's word of mouth. Well, what happens if that owner goes away? Okay, you don't have that owner's network, right? So yes, you might have a plan to market the business, but the way what you're looking at in terms of the numbers
Hello,
generated through that particular seller's network. So
Ray?
you
Don't
really
tell Mama.
sorry, man. So you really need to understand who the customers are and how they're actually marketing to those customers, and understanding whether there's any customer concentration if it's a business to business situation. Now, concentration issues in a business to business situation aren't necessarily a deal killer. So for all you new AEs, yes, you're going to hear a customer shouldn't make up more than, 10, 15% or 20% of the business, one single customer. Yeah, from a risk standpoint, that makes a lot of sense, but there's ways to mitigate that risk on the back end. But again, you need to understand what types of customers there are so that you can ask that question. So even if there's a situation where one customer makes up 25 to 30% of the business, um, okay, that's considered a substantial risk. I wouldn't necessarily kill the deal for that, but I would find ways to understand what that relationship to that customer is. Is it contractual? And are they up for some sort of a renewal? So for instance, if the contract is running out at the time that you're about to buy the business, then you want to understand the likelihood of renewing that customer. And if you can't get comfortable with that, you can actually build into your evaluation the loss of that customer or some sort of performance-based note, forgivable note that would account for the loss of that customer. But again, you have to ask the question about how does the customer base. It's a basic question. Okay, it's a basic screening question. Um, One other question I would ask: how many employees do they have? And are they actual employees, or do they make up? Are they subcontractors? Now, it's not necessarily negative that they're subcontractors, but you also have to recognize that the business that you may be looking at, a roofing company is a perfect example of this. If you look at a roofing company and it has 4 employees, and they're doing let's just say $3 million a year in revenue, um, obviously the question becomes how are they doing that if there's only 4 employees? Okay. They're probably using subs. Now, the only risk around that is that these subcontracting crews may not be exclusive to them. These subcontracting crews may be able to just walk off and start doing the work themselves. Usually, subcontractors are working with the roofing company because maybe they don't have experience in marketing and reaching out to new customers. So they're using the roofing company essentially to generate leads for them. Um, and the company's basically taking the revenue and then paying out to the subcontractors below that. So there's obviously there's margin that they're taking. Okay, so understanding the risks around whether they're subcontractors or employees is important. If they're employees, well, in this case, it wouldn't be for a roofing company, but if you're looking at another business and they're mostly made up of employees, okay, now you have to ask yourself how long those employees have been in the business. Are they hiring new employees just to make the business look stronger than it was, or have those in? Please, everyone mute their phone. Okay. Um, are they hiring those employees just because they're trying to sell the business and they're trying to make it look better or bigger than it was previously? What's the tenure of each of those employees, and who are the key employees there? One thing I would also look at when you're looking at these businesses are their employee benefits. And this is an easy question to ask. Okay, these are screening questions. You just want to understand how loyal the customer or the employees are to the business and whether they're likely to stick around. You're probably not going to get a sense in your initial pass or who the key employees are. The CIM may mention it, but a lot of times it doesn't. You'll just have to kind of guess based on the type of business and the structure of the management team that's in place, or the employees that the organizational chart that's there. It may not be a management team, but understanding how many employees they have and then using kind of almost I would actually use a revenue per employee measure to kind of to understand, the efficiency of the business. I mean, typically with these small businesses, if you're up and over around 125,000 dollars per employee, that's probably the sign of a fairly efficient business. If you're getting up to about 250 to $300,000, and this is just in general. Some industries are going to be more, more per employee than others, but I'm using a kind of a general number. If you're up around 250 to 300,000, that's a highly efficient business, and definitely worth looking at. Um, and why is the owner selling the business? I always ask any of you guys that are on the call with me. First thing, one of the first things I ask is, why is the owner selling the business? Which ties into the next question: how long has the business been on the market? So why is the owner selling the business? Is the you're all you're gonna hear a lot of times? I hear, oh, he's retiring or she's retiring. Okay, what are they retiring to do? Are they young, or are they really older where retirement makes sense? If somebody's selling their business and they're 35 years old and they've held the business for 2 years, okay, that's a red flag for me. I want to understand exactly why the seller is selling this business. And if the broker can't give you that answer, okay, check that, put a big red check next to that part of your screening criteria. And it's not necessarily, I would say, something where you're going to kick the deal to the curb, but it's something to be aware of if you don't feel good about other parts of the business. Okay. So, I mean, if he's 35, or if he or she's 35 years old and they're selling the business and they maybe held the business for 2 years, okay. The question to me, the natural question is, I would ask is why? What are they doing? What else do they have going on? If it's the fact that, hey, I've got 6 other businesses and I really don't have time to focus on that, I'm probably okay with that answer, but I want proof that they have 6 other businesses. I mean, I want to know what else this person is doing, because they're going to have to sign a non-compete at some point if I decide to buy this business, and I want to make sure that they're not starting up some competitor, 20 miles down the road. But that's a red flag for me. If they're 70 years old and they say they're retiring, I get it. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, I've checked that off. That's something that, I'm comfortable with that. If they're 50 years old, okay, I want a little bit more insight to why they want to sell the business. Okay. Do you guys ever run tests prior to the acquisition to see how it will perform? For example, a short ad campaign to see what interest is. I don't usually do that. I mean, on larger acquisitions, you'll see that done. They won't necessarily run that particular test, but they'll do a lot of market research. They'll call customers, they'll call vendors. They'll understand the nuances of the product or service that's being offered in relation to competitors. That's a lot of work, and it makes sense on a bigger deal. You're willing to spend that cash to get that to run that. On a smaller deal, I'm not gonna probably. I'm just gonna assume there's product market fit. Um, already, just by in the numbers. I see the revenue run rate, I see the margins there. I'm familiar with the industry to a certain extent. There's not a whole lot new under the sun with these smaller businesses, where you necessarily have to do that. But I mean, if you've got extra money to spend and you want to do that, by all means, it's another way to validate it. I don't know that I would do that at the initial stages of screening businesses, which is kind of where we are right now, or what we're talking about right now. Maybe as you get in a deeper level of due diligence and you're not really comfortable with the product or service, for the business that you're buying, and you may want to run that test. That might make a lot more sense. Um, so how long has the business been on the market? I mean, if the business has been on the market for, I don't know, like 9 months or 11 months, and the business looks like it's great, you come across this business, you've looked at the numbers, you're just like, wow, I can't believe it's generating $6 million a year in cash flow, and you know $10 million a year in revenue. I mean, all of it's dropping to the bottom line. I'm exaggerating here, folks. But you're looking at this, you're like, I can't believe I got this great deal. And then you talk to the broker, and the business has been on the market for 9 to 12 months and is generating that kind of cash. You know, that's a huge. There's a huge red flag going off in my head, or just flashing in front of me. Why would this business be on the market for 9 months if it's generating that kind of cash? Okay. So you always want to ask that question. How long has it been on the market? Now, some brokers may be, I would say, no, I'm gonna say it this way. Some brokers are gonna just flat out lie to you and say this business has only been on the market for 1 month or 2 months, and maybe they took it off the market. It was on the business. It was on the market for like 12 months. They took it off the market for a month, and then they put it back on the market so they can legitimately say it's only been on the market for 2 months. They changed something in the CIM or something. You're gonna come across brokers that try to pull that crap. But in general, I mean, you'll a lot of times you'll recognize when the business has been on the market for a while, but it's always great to ask that question, because if that question is answered honestly and it's been out there for 12 months, you understand going in with your offer, you're probably going to have some leverage over the seller. So you'll be able to be a little bit more creative with your offer. Okay. And then the last question, and these were just 10 questions. The last question I would ask is the owner open to seller financing? Now, this becomes important because what you guys are seeing out there in the marketplace nowadays are owners trying to sell their business just off of the last trailing 12 months of earnings, or SDE. Okay, I get it. So you got to be careful with that though, because I've kind of mentioned this before. The sellers are trying to sell a business. Let's just use an example and we'll keep the numbers simple. You have a business that's generating on average, these are their reported numbers to the IRS and the reported annual numbers. They're generating $500,000 a year, or the business is generating $500,000 a year in SDE. Okay, you apply a 3 multiple to that, and you're like, okay, I'm willing to pay $1.5 million for this business. All right. Then all of a sudden, in addition to the last 3 years, they provide you with a trailing 12-month number, and that number is $1 million. All right. Now, what's going to end up happening, and I know you guys have all seen this, is the seller is going to ask for that same multiple on that $1 million. So instead of $1.5 million of your value, they're going to want $3 million for the business. Okay. Now, there's a huge delta between what your $1.5 million and their $3 million. Okay. Some of that delta could be captured within the seller financing. Some of it may be just unreasonable. Your lender is going to go generally off of the last 3 years of reported tax returns. Okay. Generally. Now, that being said, I've seen First Internet Bank will get a little crazy and be a little bit more aggressive. But most SBA lenders are only going to go off of the filed tax returns. So you're going to have a situation where they're going to be willing to lend you 80% of $1.5 million, yet you've got this huge gap where they want $3 million. Okay. So when you see something like that, obviously, if you know the seller's open to seller financing, maybe you can still get a deal done and structured and paid. Maybe you can pay the seller closer to what they want from that standpoint, but include all that captured value in a seller finance note, which is kind of leads to why I wanted to have a discussion around structuring seller financing deals, because there's certain ways you can do this that makes sense for you, even if the business is overvalued. So in essence, you come in with this one is a little bit of an extreme, but say the seller is saying this business is worth $3 million and that's what they want. You agree to the $3 million. Well, there's a way to structure, like I always tell you guys, you tell me the price, I'll tell you the terms. So there's a way to structure a deal with a seller finance deal if they're open to seller financing, so that you're paying 80% of the $1.5 million, yet still offering $3 million to the seller for the entire business, and in a way that's protective of your interests. So as long as you structure the deal the right way, you can still end up buying a business, even a slightly overvalued business, with the right creative structure. We'll talk more about kind of different creative structures on how to do that in a couple of weeks. But that's why, but you would have to understand if the seller's open to seller financing. If they're not, and they're asking for $3 million for the business, you just basically tell them to go pound sand from that standpoint, or you come in with a lighter offer of maybe 2.2 or $2.3 million or something like that, and see where they go with that. In that case, then you may be able to still do the deal. But for the most part, you're seeing a lot of, I did this the last 12 months, so I want a multiple on that. I don't care what I did the 3 years prior to that. That's great, but I can't get financing just off of your 1 year for the most part. But if you're willing to structure the deal in a way that makes sense for both of us, maybe I get you closer to that number. Maybe it's instead of 3 million, it's 2.6 million. So understanding whether they'll accept the seller financing is key. Now, you've got all these answers to all these questions, and the last piece are the financials. Most of the information you need in the financials are going to be in the CIM for you to put together an initial offer on the deal. Okay. You should at least in the CIM have 3 years of annual financials. You should, most brokers don't really put trailing 12 months, but they may have access to it. So you may have to go back to them to ask. But if they've got trailing 12 months, that's fine. You can take all those numbers now then and then plug them into your various templates to come up with a value that makes sense. Now, one caution I want to caution you guys on before I kind of end this, and you guys are open to questions about anything you want to talk about. Going back to that example where they have $1 million in trailing 12 months, what I've seen a number of AEs do is just basically take that number at face value, plug it into their SBA calculator, and just assume that that number carries forward every single year. Okay. That's a dangerous assumption because now you're basing your financing off of assuming $1 million a year in SDEs coming or EBITDA is coming through in succeeding years. You don't know if that's you've got to do your investigative work around that 1 million. If there's that big, huge delta between the last 3 years and the trailing 12 months, you need to ask a couple more questions. What's driving that number? Was it one big job that drove that number? Are there significant customers that drove that number? One big customer or what have you that had a huge order? Or is this a result of a structural change in the business? Maybe they've got a new marketing plan. Maybe they've hired a salesperson who's outside, just kicking butt. But you have to understand that that number is sustainable before you start dropping it into your SBA calculator and assuming that it works. Because I've seen it a couple different times where that model's been presented to the lender's funded that loan, and all of a sudden 9 months into the business, we're an AE's reaching out to me. Yeah, I've got a problem, a revenue problem. Apparently, that contract ended, or that was a one-time job, and now my revenue is so low that I can't even pay my bank note. Okay, so you want to make sure that that number that you use in your SBA calculator is a sustainable. I guess I think the caption on there is your EBITDA, your annual EBITDA in the SBA calculator. Make sure, or whatever that number is, SDE, annual SDE, make sure that number is sustainable. I would actually stress it, meaning if they're doing $500,000 a year on average and all of a sudden it jumps to 1 million, when I use that calculator, I'm probably going to use $700,000 to $750,000 to see what it looks like and what level of debt I can sustain at $750,000 in annual EBITDA versus using $1 million. Because especially if you guys are looking at project-related businesses, project revenue can be very lumpy. 1 year can be up significantly, 1 year can be down if it's project-related. If it's a business you're looking at that has a huge amount of revenue that comes from recurring service agreements or, whatever, warranties or something that's just recurring revenue, you're a little bit more, you're safer from that standpoint. But there's not a whole lot of businesses out there generating, that type of revenue in this. I won't say a whole lot, but there's very few businesses been set up that way, which creates opportunities for you guys to actually go out and buy these businesses and actually get these recurring revenue, build recurring revenues into your system or into your process so that the businesses are sustainable over the long term. So understanding your revenue model and how that revenue is generated is going to be very helpful when you're doing your financial model to kind of gauge whether that number that you're seeing for the trailing 12 month, that's so much bigger than your average, if it's sustainable moving forward. That's it for today. Why am I the lucky buyer? James, your price, my terms. Very funny. Hello, Rich and Searchers. Pardon the elementary question, but what is the general format of these weekly calls? The general format of these weekly calls will be either me talking or not me talking, but me presenting something and having you guys, you guys are open to question, ask questions about it. and or usually I'll have someone on, an outside M&A professional, whether it be a banker, lawyer, accountant, um, operations person, marketing person, QOE person, where I'll have them on, I'll interview them, and then they're open for question and answer format. So that's usually how it is. Today, I wanted to really specifically talk, and this is really geared towards the new AEs, but I know some of you older AEs could stand a little bit of a refresher. But if you guys get through these questions on in your screening process and understanding those 10 questions for the most part, you guys should be able to ascertain whether this business is worth pursuing or not versus having me be the kind of bottleneck. Cause I know a lot of times I'm busy and I'm traveling or I'm, my calendar is booked up and you guys want to talk about a business. And then it's like a week or two later and all of a sudden there's opportunities, someone's, got it under LOI. So you guys have to understand how to do these preliminary screenings yourself. Um, you know, it'll help you, but obviously you guys can talk to me anytime you need to, but I just can't guarantee what my calendar looks like from that perspective.
I have a
Um,
question.
yeah.
Um, so we're talking about the reason, and I mean, I've talked to a lot of sellers at this point. So one of the unique ones is reasons that they're selling, right? So if they're not old, so for
Mhm.
example, there's a business that I'm looking at, they have crazy growth, right? Like 50%, you know, annual growth rate for the past like 5 years. It's a 5-year-old business.
Mhm.
Um, so they went from like a million, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million, 15 million. And then they, for the 2021, they did 15 million. 2022 they did or 2022 they did 15 million, and then this year they're projecting 15 million. So they kind of like
Flatlined. Yeah.
flatlined, right?
Mhm.
And the reason for the sales, so the sellers are like 39 and 41, and they say to de-risk. So
Well, so this
they're like
business is risky.
right. So they're fully basically they're just saying their full net worth is wrapped up in the
Yeah, I get it.
business.
They want to
Um,
diversify. And
and they're open to staying with the business, and then you have this whole SBA thing where they can roll equity potentially, right? But how does that make you feel, when they're like, you know what I mean, ramping it flatline, and then now they want to sell to de-risk,
yeah,
it,
that's my first thought when you lay out that scenario and they say that is they felt like they've squeezed as much growth out of this business as there can be in the business. So, yourself from your perspective, you got to ask yourself, what am I trying to buy? Am I trying to buy simply a long-term stream of cash and can this business continue on at that flat line and just generate cash for me to invest in another business down the road? Or am I looking for an opportunity to actually grow this business? If it's the second, then you really got to dig in to understand why the business flatline. Is it a situation where now there's competitors out there that are selling the same thing or offering the same service, and whereas before they weren't? And if that's the case, you have to think about, well, then how can I really grow it? Is it geographically constrained or is it a nationwide type opportunity where I can actually grow the revenues by going into different markets? Or can I offer more product, other unique products and services off of what I've been doing? But you kind of, it comes from kind of your understanding of kind of what you're trying to buy at that point. Because if you're trying to grow out, buy a growth opportunity, that may not be the business you want to look at if the original owners are trying to sell out to de-risk because they figure, all right, now I need to diversify my portfolio because I can't get any more growth from this thing. I was already greedy with it. Now let me go,
yeah, they put all
diversify
the
into
money
something
back
else.
into it, right? So
Yeah,
they made a bunch of money. So they're doing like
yeah,
1.5 million net, so about 10% net margin. So they basically ballooned the business.
yeah.
They have like 70 something employees, benefit, I can see exactly kind of what, and then they probably got the low hanging fruit because it is a new business. And they kind of came into an industry. I do see growth, right?
Hmm.
Going into other segments to kind of the same type of customers.
Yeah.
But that's not cheap either. So
No. It's not.
It's not
And
easy.
yeah.
It's not easy stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, because you think about it, it's almost like you have your brand name now at this point, but then when you start trying to offer other, let's say, products or services to your customer base, you're almost, yeah, you can leverage your brand because they bought from you before, but to a certain extent, you're almost kind of in a startup mode because now you're going into a new business. So, and those are hard. I mean, it's just hard to get a foothold. Although you do have this built-in customer base to try to sell to. The question is can you actually effectively sell to them?
Right. If, especially if they're buying probably that same thing from somebody else already. Right.
Yeah,
Which is more than
exactly.
likely the case. All right. I
Exactly.
appreciate it.
Is it a construction related business? Oh, that was Lee asking you. Is it a construction related business that has slowed down? Uh, oh, you play apparel manufacturing. I'm behind. Home
Yeah.
services.
No,
Oh,
yeah. Apparel manufacturing. Yeah.
has EBITDA stayed the same while it plateaued? Okay, so those are questions for you. Um,
Hey,
all right.
Rich.
Yeah.
Hey, hey, Paul here. Hey, I had a
Hey, Paul.
question about, hey, I'm looking at a specific opportunity, but I think the question could be valuable for others. It's a little off the topic today, but one of the things I want to ask about was like, I'm looking at a company that's in one of the trades, but they're 100% commercial. And, the thing that I notice about this, just the nature of their book of business, it seems to be highly capital intensive. Um, do you have any kind of guidelines or rules of thumb for how we should think about, kind of working capital that's going to be required, for something that probably is going to have a bit more capital intensive just due to the nature of more commercial work, scale projects, like multifamily, those kind of effects. Any kind of thumb rules that are good to keep in mind? Because it looks like a couple of million on the books right now that they've got to work with, and I think that's quite a lot you got to bring to be able to bring to the table.
Yeah, I mean, really, these B2B opportunities that are, I guess when you say capital intensive, you're basically saying capital in terms of cash. There's
Yeah,
a lot of cash
high.
required, not necessarily you're spending on capital equipment per se.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, like high
Working capital
spending.
requirements.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing you want to understand from the get go is, especially when you're evaluating a business to business deal with where there are kind of working capital drags. Um, I would one thing that I would ask um, early on in that process is, obviously you want to understand the customer base, but you also want to understand the payment pattern in the business. So one thing you want to find out is basically the cash conversion cycle. So depending on the business, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's trades related or what have you, you got to understand kind of the front end where the cash is, where the revenue is generated all the way through to where you're paid. So I would try to understand kind of like that cash to cash cycle, meaning, you know, when they bill, how often do they bill? Um,
Yeah.
how often does it, what are their typical terms? And I would basically get an aging report. If they tell you their typical terms are, we get paid every 45 to 60 days. But then you grab an aging report. You should always, on a business to business deal, always get an aging report to go with your financials. So ask the broker, can you provide me with the latest accounts receivable aging report and the latest accounts payable aging report, because you want to see kind of how often they're turning their bills versus how much they're actually collecting on top of that. But take that that AR aging and compare the terms to actual payments. Like, see, you basically want to find if their terms are 45 days and you look at the aging and all of a sudden you realize that, well, their customers on average are paying about every 90 days. Okay. Then the next question I would ask before moving on is, and the broker should have the answer to this, is how are they currently financing this gap? They have a relationship with their bank, their lender, that's fine. You probably can obtain that same type of a relationship. If they're going outside to, maybe if they're selling, let's just say selling, I've seen this where they're selling their receivables for recourse, where they're selling them to a finance lender. That lender basically has financed them with recourse, meaning if the finance lender can't collect that cash, they're coming right back to the seller's business, holding them responsible for the cash. They could be non-recourse financing, but you want to understand exactly how they're financing that gap. If you hear something where, and I've seen this, where the seller himself is financing the gap out of his own cash, that's a negative.
Well, that's exactly, yeah, that you hit the nail on that. That's exactly what I'm worried about. And you make a great point about the aging, because when I looked at this, I'm like, look, you got a couple $1,000,000 in a money market.
Mhm.
I'm assuming there's going to be some float there, and I need to know, like, what does it actually look like? So yeah, great point on the aging. I need to go back and ask for that.
Yeah, that'll at least give you some comparison to see kind of how much you're gonna have to, how much of those sales you're gonna have to finance from day one, because you're gonna have, even if you bought the business, you're gonna still have, if you've got 90 days worth of revenue out, or it's not gonna be paid if there's revenue recorded. They've collected it before the transfer of the business, and there's a fresh new 90 days of revenue out there. Let's just say you're gonna have 3 months where you're still gonna have to pay employees and you're still gonna have to pay bills. Okay.
Yep.
So you
Yep.
want to understand exactly kind of how they're doing that currently. And yeah, and it's a red flag if I see the seller is financing it, all of it through his own cash. Now, if it's the business's cash, that's fine. That means the business built up a cash pool to cover those costs. But if what I'm saying is I've seen an owner actually personally lend the business money to cover those bills. And
Okay.
that's a scary proposition for me, because that tells me that the business wasn't strong enough to qualify for its own financing. And it may not still be once you buy the business, or the lenders see it as ultra risky from that standpoint. If the business built up a cash pool, like you said, a money market, they have a money market account. That's not a bad thing, as long as they're not running losses on the bottom line. So if you were to go to their P&L and all of a sudden you see losses because they're not paying bills because they're holding cash to use as working capital, you know,
Oh yeah,
that's
no,
that's a problem.
they're good on that. I think it's just I get a little worried about the scale of some of the projects. No, that's really helpful, Rich. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. I
no
appreciate it.
problem. No problem. No problem. Anyone else have any questions? Again, we don't have to stay on for the full hour. No? All right. Well, good. All right. So, everyone, next week, be on the call. We will have Jordan from Ameris Bank on, and have your list of questions lined up for your weird scenarios. He loves answering specific scenarios. He's a nerd about this stuff, which I love, which is why I like to have him on these calls. So, if you've got questions about the SBA process, and especially the new regulations, have them written down and ready to ask. I know I have a number of questions. People talk about this retained equity. By the way, so when I talked about the rollover equity, and this is probably good for you, the 29 people left on this call, because you might come across this between now and then. And I know, for instance, one AE on this call is already, we've had a discussion internally, and my thoughts around it have been kind of, I don't know. People don't believe me, but I've talked to a number of lenders, and they've kind of given me the answer to my question. But from a retained equity standpoint, okay, so when you're buying a business under an SBA loan, the only person, or anyone that's providing 20% or more of the capital, has to sign a personal guarantee. Everybody understand that, right? Okay. Now, if you're buying a business and you're the let's just say the seller is, well, they're selling you the business, but they're going to roll over some amount of equity in the business. Now, I think most people are under the impression that if the seller retains 20% or more of the equity, that's when they have to provide a personal guarantee. I'm going to tell you right now, every lender I've spoken to, and there's a different interpretation by some other lenders, but every lender I've spoken to has said no. If the seller retains any amount of equity, whether it be 1% or whether it be 3, 4, 5%, the lender's going to ask for them to be a personal guarantor on the loan. And so there's some confusion around this. So this is going to be one of the I guess the biggest questions I asked him, and I think everyone else is confused about it because according to actually the SBA, there's not really any specific mention about it in the SBA regulation. It just allows for partial buyouts. But in terms of the interpretation, there's been a lot of going back and forth between lenders and the SBA. And most of the lenders I've talked to, almost all of actually all the lenders I've talked to, have interpreted that those regulations as if the seller retains even a percentage of equity in the business, the seller has to be a guarantor on the loan under the assumption that the seller, while not being the main owner of the business anymore, could still have major influence in the business if they're sticking around. Because that's the employees see that owner as still kind of the owner. Um, so I think it's a question that we're going to ask Jordan to get some clarification on. I know he can give me the right answer. So maybe he'll come back and say, no, if it's less than 20%, they don't have to be on the loan. Or he's going to come back and say, no, if they own 1%, they have to be on the loan. So that's a big question. So some of you guys may come across that and trying to structure your deals now between now and the next week. So I just wanted you guys to be aware that that could be a problem from the seller standpoint, because obviously if you're buying the business and the seller is maintaining this small sliver of equity, they have no desire to be a personal guarantor on your loan. So just be
So
aware of that.
to chime on to that, um, so the actual writing in the SOP says that all owners, right, are subject to the guarantees in the guarantee section. However, the percentages of ownership for this requirement will be based on the post-sale percentage of ownership in the business. So the only reason that's interesting is that actually hasn't changed. So they just issued a new update yesterday. So they issued, their latest SOP that goes into effect in November. That didn't change. That was actually in the August 1st SOP, the exact same wording. And Live Oak has, or at least the search fund department of Live Oak, Lisa Forrest, you know her.
Yeah.
So she publicly said that Live Oak is currently, or before yesterday even, they said that they're publicly, they're interpreting it that it is exactly as it says, right? Post-sale ownership. So if they have 19 or less than 20%, right? So if they roll less than 20%, they won't have to PG unless there's another, like they can require one, right? So they're allowed to. But in a general circumstance, if it's under 20%, they're not.
Okay. So Bank of the
And
Lake, I know I talked to them the other day and they're like, no, if they're like any seller owns any percentage of the business post sale, they're going to require that
so
seller to
they
be
are
on.
now. So I think they actually switched their stance, because the caveat with Live Oak is that they were expecting, with this new update that was yesterday, they
Yeah.
were expecting because they were talking with their SBA rep or whatever, and they were under the impression that they were going to revise this, okay, and that it was going to have a 6-month look back clause, right?
Yeah.
So they were told that basically, the wording that as it says now, right? So post sale percentage, they were going to add on an addendum that said with a 6-month look back, of whatever the ownership
Yeah. So
was,
if you
right?
own more than 20% or more 6 months prior, then you're going to be on it. And that's
Exactly.
how
So any owner, basically.
yeah. And that's kind of how the lenders have been, every lender I've talked to, that's kind of what they've been using is that 6-month look back period.
Right. So in Live Oak said that, they were prior to yesterday, right? And
Yeah.
I haven't heard from her since.
Yeah.
They actually have a thing tomorrow. They have like a Zoom thing. I'm going to ask her directly. They have a thing where basically they said that, this is where we stand now. We're taking it literally at face value, but we're expecting it to change on the 24th or 25th, whenever, really, I think it was yesterday. We're expecting it to change to this, but for now we're on board with they're on board with it, right? And I think that Bank of the Lake also is, with this new update. I think that they've kind of come around that they're taking it at face value, but they require something. They have like certain requirements around
Okay.
that. But as far as like ownership, because I was talking with Bruce, he's on Twitter a lot, but
Yeah.
So I think that they're also kind of changing their stance on that. The guys that we were on, like before, because we had a call, they obviously everybody was basically waiting for somebody else to kind of make a determination, right? And
Yeah.
Live Oak's the biggest one, right? So Live Oak is like the, elephant in the room when it comes to SBA lending, right? They do like 75% of all the volume or something ridiculous. So, when Live Oak was like, okay, we're doing this, I think a lot of the smaller ones like, okay, well, if they're going to do that, we're going to do that. And they haven't said anything since the update. And I'm going to figure that out
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah. That's
Because
why
it didn't
I'll be
change like they expected it to, right?
yeah. That's why I'll be interested to hear what Jordan says, because that guy's
Yeah,
been tied in and goes to all the
he's smart
conferences
too.
and knows people at the SBA office. So I want to really get his take on it as well.
Me too.
'Cause-
Yeah. And he talks with these other banks too, and they're all kind of
Yeah.
intermingled, right?
Yeah.
And like he said it, or the last call that he was on, he was like, hey, you think that this is going into effect in May or whatever. He's like, or July. He's like, listen, you'll be lucky to see it this year. he's like, he's
He
like,
was
you'll be
right.
lucky to, he's literally right. Here we are in friggin' the end of October, November, and I don't think they've done one deal
Yeah.
with any sort of anything that's changed since they went into effect in August, right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you, James, for your contribution on that.
yep, no problem.
Appreciate it. All right, you guys. So I'll see you next week, and then the week after we will get into structuring seller notes, and then the week after that, I think I'm going to have the exciting world of accounting. I'll have an accounting firm on to talk about some things that are important around business acquisition and post acquisition. So until then, adios, my friends. See you guys all on the ICs, or see you when I meet with you on the calendar.